Chapter 166. Go to Watch Network. Early the next morning, Wan Hongling still jumped from the balcony to the balcony of Li Yundong's house. She stretched her head to take a look, only to find that there was no one in the room. She called out, but there was no response. Wan Hongling muttered to herself, "This bastard hasn't practiced all night, has he?" Just as he was hesitating, Wan Hongling focused her attention and listened carefully. Sure enough, she heard a slight sound of something tearing through the air. Wan Hongling shook her head and snorted coldly, "What a hopeless idiot. I already told him that haste makes waste, but he just doesn't listen. Does he think he can train it in one night? What a fool's dream." As she spoke, she looked around on the balcony. After finding that no one was paying attention, she tapped her toes and flew up to the roof. As soon as she got on the roof, Wan Hongling's eyes widened. She saw a black ball rolling on the balcony. Countless golden Sanskrit characters were floating outside the black ball. Although it was daytime, they were still shining with golden light, as if they were a layer of golden Buddha characters. The black ball kept making a whistling sound, and sand and stones were flying like a strong wind. There was also a dense clanging sound in the middle of the whistling sound, which was the sound of the iron fan opening and closing. If one closed their eyes and listened, it seemed that thousands of soldiers were pulling out their long swords from their scabbards one after another. The sound was sonorous and murderous. Wan Hongling's eyes widened, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She stammered, This isn't him waving the fan, is it?" While he was hesitating, the black ball suddenly disappeared. The golden characters around the black ball also floated and twisted for a while before slowly dissipating in the air. In the middle of it, a man with white steam rising from his body appeared. It was Li Yundong. Li Yunyang shook his wrist, and all the leaves of the fan of 7 treasures, which was as tall as a man, suddenly closed. The black light and golden pagoda of the black fan and the golden Sanskrit also disappeared. But with a loud shout, he threw the fan of 7 treasures above his head. With a swoosh, the iron fan opened again in an instant, whistling and spinning violently in the air like a razor that kept spinning. As soon as the fan left his hand, he instantly kicked 3 times in a row, and the bones in his body made a strong and powerful sound. As soon as he finished the 3 kicks, the fan of 7 treasures, which was rolling in the air, suddenly fell down. The sharp edges of the fan rotated at a high speed like a saw. As long as an object was cut by it, even if it was a steel bar, it would immediately be cut in half. Li Yundong saw it accurately. He stretched out his hand toward the flying and rolling fan and accurately pinched the bones of the fan. She looked at Li Yundong in shock and thought to herself, is he bragging? It's one thing for him to practice the fan of 7 treasures so skillfully in one night, but he can also immediately come up with a killing move from the use of this iron fan? Is this guy a freak? Even if he's a genius, he shouldn't be so exaggerated, right? Wan Hongling looked Li Yundong up and down as if she had seen a visitor from outer space. When Ziyuan also went up to the roof, she came to her senses. She took Ziyuan's arm, pointed at Li Yundong, and said, "Sister Ziyuan, just now, he. For a moment, Wan Hongling couldn't find the right words to describe Li Yundong. Ziyuan looked at Wan Hongling in confusion. "What's wrong with you?" Wan Hongling stared at Li Yundong and thought to herself, this guy's cultivation progress is so fast. It won't be long before he surpasses me. Thinking of this, Wan Hongling felt sour in her heart. She said with flagging interest, "It's nothing. You can ask him." Ziyuan looked at Li Yundong in confusion again. Li Yundong had some respect for this female cultivator who looked like a fairy. He smiled slightly and said, "It's nothing. I just practiced the fan of 7 treasures all night and finally made some progress. I have some experience." Wan Hongling rolled her eyes and thought to herself, "You've practiced so skillfully. How can this be called a little progress and experience?" However, Zi Yuan didn't take it seriously, as if she didn't believe it. There was a hint of blame in her tone as she said, "Why didn't you listen to what you said before? Didn't I tell you that cultivation should follow the way of heaven and the rules? You must sleep when it's time to sleep. Why don't you sleep at night?" Li Yundong smiled bitterly and said, "You two left so suddenly last night and left me alone on the roof. I can go up, but I can't go down." Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling were stunned at the same time. Then Ruan Hongling raised her head and burst into laughter. Zi Yuan couldn't help but burst into laughter. She turned her head to the side and covered her mouth to snicker. Li Yundong said helplessly amid the laughter, "I'm alone on this roof. If I don't practice the fan of 7 treasures, what else can I do?" Zi Yuan laughed for a while. She pursed her lips slightly and said with a smile in her eyes, "It's my fault. Now hurry up and go down with us. Have a good rest later. I have something to tell you." Li Yundong nodded, then held Zi Yuan's outstretched hand. After a while, he returned to his home. Zi Yuan said, "This is the time when the yang qi is strong. You can sit facing the east and practice qi. Although it can't make up for the sleepiness caused by you not sleeping last night, it can at least keep you from feeling tired for a day." Li Yundong nodded and did as he was told. Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling looked at each other and left Li Yundong's house from the balcony. Li Yundong faced the rising sun and meditated to practice qi. He only felt that his whole body was warm, as if there was a hot current flowing in his body. Wherever it flowed, he felt comfortable and refreshed, and his fatigue immediately disappeared. He didn't know how long he had been doing this. When he was done, he opened his eyes and found that Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling were staring at him. Li Yundong was stunned. "What's wrong?" Ruan Hongling's expression was a little strange and she didn't say a word. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "It's nothing. The Jindan Yuan Qi and Tongzi Yuan Qi in your body are not easy to come by. You should cherish them." "Why does this sound so strange?" Li Yundong muttered in his heart. He didn't answer Zi Yuan's words, but his eyes swept over Ruan Hongling's hand. He suddenly smiled embarrassedly and said, "You brought me food again? How can I trouble you all the time?" "Thank you." Ruan Hongling snorted and said, "You also know how to say thank you." After that, she put the plastic bag in her hand on the tea table. Although Li Yundong had been arguing with Ruan Hongling for the past few days, Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan had been helping him no matter what. Li Yundong saw this and remembered it in his heart. Although he didn't say it out loud, he was secretly grateful in his heart. Especially towards Zi Yuan, he had a lot of respect in his heart, and even his attitude towards Ruan Hongling had improved a lot. Although Li Yundong heard Ruan Hongling talk about him, he didn't argue with her. He opened the plastic bag and took out the lunchbox inside. He was about to eat when he suddenly thought of something. He looked up and asked, "By the way, have you eaten?" Before Zi Yuan could speak, Ruan Hongling snorted and said, "God has pity on you. You also know how to care about others. The two of us are still hungry." Zi Yuan looked at Ruan Hongling reproachfully and said to Li Yundong apologetically, "Don't listen to her nonsense. We all ate this morning." Li Yundong laughed and said, "It's noon now. You told me that you ate in the morning. Aren't you scolding me?" As he said this, Li Yundong stood up and said, "Wait here for a while. I'll go out for a while." As he said this, he walked to the door. Just as he was about to go out, he suddenly turned around and said, "By the way, can you come through the door next time? Don't always fly around the balcony like a cat thief, okay?" As he said this, he went out without waiting for Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling to reply. Ruan Hongling turned her head to look at Zi Yuan and said angrily, "Sister Zi Yuan, he called us a cat thief." Zi Yuan smiled slightly and didn't say anything. Seeing that she hadn't succeeded in fanning the flames, Wan Hongling rolled her eyes and said, "Sister Zi Yuan, what do you think he's doing?" Zi Yuan said with a smile, "You already know the answer in your heart. Why do you still ask me?" "Sir, I miss you, /om/." Chapter 168. Go to see net. Li Yundong suddenly received a call from Su Chan, which was really a pleasant surprise. However, when he suddenly heard Su Chan burst into tears, he suddenly panicked. He walked to the balcony and whispered, "Girl, what's wrong? I miss you too." Su Chan was scared at first, but she finally found an opportunity to call Li Yundong's cell phone. She was afraid that no one would answer, and she was also afraid that another woman would answer the phone. While waiting anxiously, the little girl finally heard Li Yundong's familiar and gentle voice. She suddenly couldn't help crying. Go to see net. 7 K.O.M. Su Chan sobbed and said, "Master, do you not want me anymore?" Hearing Su Chan's voice, Li Yundong's heart ached a little. The longing that had been suppressed because of the high-intensity cultivation in the past few days was suddenly aroused. He said softly, "Don't be silly. How could I not want you?" Hearing Li Yundong comforting her, Su Chan wiped her tears and said, "There are so many beautiful women around you all day long. Will you fall in love with them?" Li Yundong suddenly felt happy in his heart. He couldn't help laughing and said, "Jealous? Not bad. Didn't you always push me to other beautiful women before?" Su Chan sniffled and choked, "You're so annoying. Answer my question first." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Silly girl, there are so many beautiful women in the world, but I only like you." Su Chan was overjoyed when she heard this. Holding the phone, she couldn't help but smile. "Why?" Li Yundong said softly, "Because the girl has been with me from the beginning." Su Chan giggled when she heard this. She remembered the woman's cold snort when she answered her phone and couldn't help curling her lips. "Then why was there another woman talking on your phone just now?" Li Yundong was stunned. "Another woman? No, I just received your phone call. I just went out to buy vegetables." Su Chan pouted and said, "But there was a woman who answered my call before you." She snorted and hung up. Humph, Li Yundong couldn't help but look back at the living room. Wan Hongling had been paying attention to Li Yundong. She felt a little guilty in her heart. When she saw Li Yundong looking at her, she immediately avoided his eyes. Watch net. 7 K.O.M. Li Yundong was not stupid. He immediately understood what was going on. Although he was angry in his heart, he did not show it on the phone. He still said in a soft voice, "It should be someone else who answered the phone." She seemed to have thought of something and asked tentatively, "Yundong, is Zi Yuan teaching you cultivation now?" Li Yundong paused. "How did you know?" Su Chan giggled. "There's nothing I don't know. There's nothing I don't know." Li Yundong laughed and said, "Wow, you're so shameless to blow the conch. Your master must have told you." Su Chan didn't blush. She giggled and said, "My master is so smart." Su Chan responded in a low voice, "Oh." But after a while, she raised her head timidly and asked weakly, "Then, master, when can I contact him again?" Ao Wushuang snorted and said, "Wait until he passes the divine punishment." "Oh," Su Chan said and lowered her head. After a while, she raised it again and asked weakly, "Then, master, how do I know when he will pass the divine punishment?" Ao Wushuang looked at Su Chan speechlessly. "You are a three-tailed spiritual fox. Why are you acting like an idiot who has just entered the cultivation world? When the divine punishment comes, how can the cultivation world not know about it?" "Oh," Su Chan said again and lowered her head. But after a while, she raised it again. Just as she was about to speak, she saw Ao Wushuang glaring at her angrily. Su Chan was so scared that she quickly lowered her head again. She didn't dare to raise it no matter what, but her eyes were rolling in their sockets. She looked around with shifty eyes, as if she was thinking about something. After a while, Ao Wushuang handed her a train ticket and said, "Let's go." "I just got the ticket." Su Chan took the train ticket, looked at the destination, and said strangely, "Master, what are we going to Dongwu City for?" Ao Wushuang sighed and said, "Why don't you want to make progress at all? How can our Fox Zen school have such a strange person like you? Do you want your lover to leave you far behind in the future? Are you going to leave your cultivation behind? In the end, don't become a burden to him." Su Chan suddenly raised her head and asked in surprise, "Master, where are you taking me to cultivate?" "It's a good place for cultivation. Now that you've entered the secular world, I think you won't be able to stop if I take you back to the mountains. You might as well cultivate in Dongwu City. I also have a place to stay there, so you can cultivate in peace." Ao Wushuang nodded and said, Dongwu City is a 1,000-year-old ancient city with deep qi veins, beautiful mountains and clear waters, and a beautiful place for outstanding people." Su Chan smiled in surprise and said, "Then can I tell Yundong where I'm going first?" Ao Wushuang was furious. B****, you're so sentimental. What kind of cultivation do you have?" Su Chan lowered her head and pouted. She looked unconvinced and muttered, "Aren't you the same?" Ao Wushuang was immediately defeated by Su Chan. She rubbed her temples, sighed helplessly, and said, "Save it. When his divine punishment is over, he will naturally know where you are." Su Chan blinked her eyes and responded. After a while, she asked again, "Master." Ao Wushuang was a little crazy. "What else?" Su Chan asked weakly, "Why do we have to take the train? Isn't it better to fly?" Ao Wushuang pointed to the sky and couldn't help but say angrily, "You fool, don't you see that there are so many dark clouds in the sky? It's summer now, when there are the most heavenly thunder. Do you want to fly up and be struck by lightning?" Su Chan shrunk her head and mumbled, "Didn't I forget?" Ao Wushuang was so angry that her phoenix eyes widened. "Are you deliberately annoying me?" Su Chan immediately took Ao Wushuang's arm with a smile and said coquettishly, "No, I wouldn't dare." Ao Wushuang loved her disciple very much. Otherwise, she wouldn't have protected her in every way. She would rather risk her life to lead the pursuers away and let Su Chan go alone with the Renyuan Jindan. She couldn't stand the little girl's coquettishness. As soon as Su Chan acted like a spoiled child, the anger in her heart dissipated. Although she still couldn't pull her face down, there was a faint smile in her eyes. "Humph, you don't dare. Is there anything you don't dare to do?" As she spoke, she shouted, "Hurry up and pack your things. Follow me quickly. Aren't you afraid of missing the train?" "Oh," Su Chan said and began to pack her things in a hurry. But after a while, she suddenly stopped, turned her head, and said with a groan, "Master, I'm hungry." Ao Wushuang threw a plastic bag over and said, "Let's eat this." Su Chan opened it and was immediately disappointed. Xiaobing? It's still cold." Ao Wushuang said angrily, "I made this myself. It's good to have something to eat. You've never been picky before. Do you want to eat it? If not, give it back to me." How could Su Chan be willing to give it back? It was better than nothing. She immediately put on a protective look and took a bite. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and a tooth was almost broken by the hot Xiaobing. The little girl let out a cry and covered her cheeks. She thought of the delicious food that Li Yundong had made for her in the past, and then looked at the cold and hard Xiaobing in front of her. She didn't know how many years it had been there. Suddenly, she felt sad. Her eyes were full of tears, and her heart was cold. The more Su Chan thought about it, the sadder she became. She couldn't help curling her lips and saying, "It's not as delicious as Yundong's food." Ao Wushuang looked at her and couldn't help laughing out loud. Evil Disciple, /om/. Chapter 169. Go to Watch Net. After Su Chan hung up the phone, Li Yundong returned to the room and looked back and forth at Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling with an unfriendly expression. Go to Watch Net. Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling were both cultivators, so they had excellent hearing. They had clearly heard what Li Yundong had said before. Therefore, one of them looked magnanimous, while the other looked sneaky. Li Yundong's heart was as clear as a mirror. Li Yundong's eyes were so sharp that Ruan Hongling couldn't help but slap the table and say, "Well, stop looking. I answered the phone before. What do you think?" Li Yundong said angrily in a deep voice, "Why did you answer my call? And why did you hang up with a snort?" Ruan Hongling had never been questioned by a boy like this before. She immediately stood up and said loudly, "I just don't want to see you abandon yourself and hang out with those evil monsters." Li Yundong saw that not only did she not apologize, but she also said such words. He immediately became furious and said, "It's none of your business who I'm with. Please don't meddle in other people's business in the future." Ruan Hongling had been secretly praising Li Yundong in her heart, and her impression of him had greatly improved. But at this time, she suddenly felt that the man in front of her was simply the most hateful person in the world. She couldn't help but say angrily, "Who wants to meddle in your business? Bah! If it weren't for Sister Zi Yuan, I wouldn't have bothered to talk to you." As she said this, she turned her head and rushed to the balcony, jumping back. Zi Yuan looked helplessly at Li Yundong, who was still angry, and sighed slightly. "Why do you have to do this?" Li Yundong said angrily, "It's fine if I don't settle the score with her for hurting Su Chan. How can she touch my personal belongings? What right does she have to touch my things? Didn't her parents discipline her well?" Zi Yuan sighed and said, "Hongling's parents died when she was a child. I brought her up. If you want to blame someone, blame me." Although Li Yundong was angry, he still respected Zi Yuan very much. He just turned his head to the side and didn't say anything. Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "Although time is still a little tight, if you keep practicing here like this, the effect won't be very good. Why don't you go to Tibet tomorrow?" Li Yundong asked in surprise, "Why are you going to Tibet?" Zi Yuan said with a serious expression, "Cultivation." Li Yundong became more and more confused. Why do you have to go to Tibet to cultivate? When cultivators reach the Zhuji phase, they often choose to do so on the mountain. Do you know why? Li Yundong shook his head. "I don't know." Watch Net. Zi Yuan said, "Because the mountain is the place where the spirit qi in the world gathers the most. Not only is the air good, but it is also closer to the imperial court of cloud sky, so it is easier to feel the power of the sky and the earth. The higher the mountain, the more it is like this." Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He could vaguely feel her intentions. He asked tentatively, "Do you mean that I should go to the Zhuji phase on the mountain in Tibet?" Zi Yuan nodded. "Times are different now. Basically, the famous mountains have been greatly contaminated by the world, but the mountains in Tibet have not. They are still pure. Therefore, you can go there to cultivate your foundation." Li Yundong thought for a while, then sighed and said, "That's good, but I don't have the money to go." Zi Yuan smiled and said, "Why, do you still want to fly over?" "No, you can run there yourself." Li Yundong was dumbfounded. Run there? You must be joking, right?" "No, I'm not joking at all." Zi Yuan stopped smiling and said solemnly, "Although the zhenqi in your body is majestic and strong, it is not condensed. You can take advantage of the journey to slowly temper the zhenqi in your body, especially the first time you run. Don't stop. Run as long as you can until you can't stand it anymore. By the way, bring your fan of 7 treasures with you. Li Yundong thought that he would have to carry the fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms, all the way to Tibet. He couldn't help but shiver and stare blankly. Seeing his expression, Zi Yuan was not surprised. She just said softly, "If you don't go through the bone-chilling cold, how can you smell the fragrance of plum blossoms? Don't think that cultivation is a very simple thing. It is the most difficult way of heaven in the world, so naturally, it has to go through the most tests. If you feel that you can't hold on, think about the agreement you made with Su Chan." Li Yundong's heart suddenly trembled, and his eyes gradually revealed a firm look. He nodded to Zi Yuan and said, "I understand. Where am I going in Tibet?" Zi Yuan smiled slightly. "Where is the highest in Tibet?" Li Yundong said in surprise, "You don't mean Mount Everest in the Himalayas, do you?" Zi Yuan smiled and said, "Where else is higher?" Li Yundong smiled bitterly. "You don't want me to climb to the top of Mount Everest to build the Zhuji phase, do you? I'm afraid I'll freeze to death before I can climb to the top of the mountain." Zi Yuan said, "You don't have to reach the top of the mountain. When you climb to a certain level, the Zhenqi in your body will have a strong reaction, and then you can start building the Zhuji phase. Go to the internet. 7KOM. I can't tell you the specifics. You're the only one who knows this kind of thing best." Li Yundong took a deep breath and said, "I understand. When should I go?" Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "You can prepare first. Tomorrow." Li Yundong was stunned. "Tomorrow? So soon?" Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong seriously. "Do you think there's still a lot of time left for you?" Li Yundong didn't say anything. He went back into the room and began to tidy up his clothes. Zi Yuan stood outside the door and watched for a while. Seeing that Li Yundong had sorted out a lot of things and even stuffed his notebook into his bag, she couldn't help saying, "Just prepare 2 sets of clothes. Don't bring too many things. Just the fan of 7 treasures is enough for you." Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, then began to clear out the things in the bag. He only prepared a few sets of clothes, then he thought for a moment, poured a few bottles of water, and put them in the bag. Li Yundong was busy for a while, and suddenly remembered a very important thing. He only had a few hundred yuan on him. How could it be enough to spend on the way? Zi Yuan seemed to notice what Li Yundong was thinking. She said, "Are you worried that the travel expenses along the way might not be enough?" Li Yundong smiled awkwardly and said, "Yes, I only have a little money on me." Zi Yuan said, "You're not thinking about buying food when you're hungry and finding a hotel to sleep when you're sleepy, are you?" Li Yundong couldn't help but ask, "Are we going to go there on an empty stomach all the way? Sleep when you're sleepy?" Zi Yuan didn't answer and asked, "Do you know how I cultivated back then?" Li Yundong shook his head. Zi Yuan said, "At that time, I begged alms all the way and walked more than 2,000 miles. When I was hungry, I found food on the ground. When I was thirsty, I drank water from the mountains. When I was sleepy, I found a place to sit down and take a nap. It took me 35 days to reach my destination." Li Yundong couldn't help but look at her in shock. He couldn't imagine how a fairy-like woman like her, who had an otherworldly temperament, could complete this kind of ascetic monk-like cultivation. Zi Yuan said, "Every year, the Buddhist disciples of the Lamaism have to walk 1 or 2,000 kilometers in order to make a pilgrimage. They are much more miserable than us, but there are still countless devout believers who go to the snow mountain every year. Even mortals like them can stand it. As the successor of Jindan stage, can't you stand it? If you can't stand it, how can you stand it when the divine tribulation comes? When heaven is about to give a person a great responsibility, it must first satisfy his will, tire his muscles and bones, starve his skin, empty his body, and mess up his actions. Therefore, it is necessary to be patient and do what he can't do. Zi Yuan said word by word, her tone unprecedentedly solemn. Don't think that cultivation is the easiest thing in this world just because you've reached the sky in one step. On the contrary, if you haven't experienced real sharpening and you meet a strong opponent in the future, even if your spiritual energy surpasses that of others, it will be easy for your will to be destroyed and defeated, because you haven't experienced real sharpening. Li Yundong suddenly became solemn. He nodded and finally treated this cultivation as the most difficult thing in his life. He first sat down and thought about it carefully, then suddenly stood up and went to the room to find a pair of scissors. Then, he cut open a few pieces of his clothes and wrapped the cut strips of cloth around the fan of 7 treasures. Zi Yuan looked at his movements and nodded secretly. There was a hint of appreciation on her face. By the way, this fan of 7 treasures must not be seen by others. Otherwise, if other cultivators see it, they might be tempted by the treasure and try to snatch it. After Li Yundong wrapped the fan of 7 treasures, he made a strap with a thick strip of cloth and carried it on his back. He walked around the living room, tried to run, and jumped a few times. Then, he took off the fan of 7 treasures and readjusted the length of the strap. When he felt that it could be carried on his back diagonally, he nodded in satisfaction. Zi Yuan watched him walk to the door, squat down, and begin to put on his shoes. She asked in confusion, "You don't want to go out now, do you?" Li Yundong didn't look back, and there was a rare firmness in his voice. "As you said, I don't have much time left. If I delay 1 more second, I will waste 1 more second. Anyway, I've eaten today, so I might as well go out now." As he spoke, Li Yundong had already put on his shoes. He stood up, stamped his feet, and then looked at Zi Yuan. "Is there anything else I should pay attention to?" Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "Don't be nosy on the way, especially after entering Tibet. Try not to get in touch with the locals and don't get into disputes with them. Everything is about cultivating the Zhuji phase. When you complete the Zhuji phase, I will come to find you." Li Yundong nodded. He carried his tidied clothes and the fan of 7 treasures on his back. Before he went out, he looked back at Zi Yuan and nodded. "Well, thank you." Zi Yuan smiled slightly. "You don't have to thank me. I'm also doing it for my own cultivation." Li Yundong was stunned, but he didn't have time to think about it. He just said goodbye to Zi Yuan and went out by himself. After leaving Hongsheng New Area, Li Yundong immediately ran to the nearest newsstand and bought a map of the whole country and Tiannan City. He looked at the map for a while, confirmed the direction, and then began the long and arduous journey of cultivation. He was carrying a big iron fan that was nearly as tall as a person and wrapped tightly with cloth strips. There was also a bundle hanging on the big iron fan, which looked strange and immediately attracted the attention of the passers-by. Li Yundong felt a little strange under these gazes. He couldn't help but speed up his pace. As he ran, Li Yundong suddenly thought of what Zi Yuan had said to him, "Run all the way, this can temper your zhenqi." Although Li Yundong didn't understand why running could temper his zhenqi, he still did it. In the early summer of June, on the streets of Tiannan City, a young man carrying a heavy luggage was running quickly, attracting the attention of many passers-by along the way. The sun was hanging high in the sky. Li Yundong couldn't help but raise his head and look at the vast sky. This was the first time he had gone so far alone, and it was the first time he had gone to such a far place with 2 legs. He couldn't help but sigh and feel confused. Where was his path? What would this cultivation journey be like? How would he build the Zhuji phase when he reached the Himalayas? He didn't know. He didn't know any of this. The only thing he knew was that if he wanted to know the answer, he could only slowly explore on the journey. This was not only the first long journey in his life, but also the first journey he had embarked on the road of cultivation. No one knew how far this young man would go in order to become stronger. /om/ Chapter 170. Go to see net. In the past, when Li Yundong was an otaku, he had never thought that eating and sleeping were also a kind of cultivation. Even running was a kind of cultivation. Ever since Li Yundong had read Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, although he couldn't fully understand all the content in it for a while, he relied on his strong memory to forcibly memorize the content in his mind. In the future, he would naturally understand it slowly. Go to see net. When he first started running, he didn't feel anything strange about his body. This was because his body had been transformed by the Renyuan Jindan to become extraordinarily strong. This kind of strength not only included strength, but also a strong adaptability and durability. Ordinary people could carry 100 kilograms of things, so Li Yundong could carry 500 kilograms of things. Ordinary people would gasp for breath after running 500 meters, but Li Yundong could still run 5,000 meters in one breath without a change in his expression and heart rate. But when Li Yundong carried the psychic fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms, and ran for nearly 10 kilometers, he began to feel that there was a stream of hot air constantly rising in his body. This hot air continued to expand, turning his chest and internal organs upside down. This feeling made Li Yundong very uncomfortable at first, just like what he had experienced when he went on a rampage in school. It was as if he had become a pressure cooker, and his body was full of swelling hot air. The more he ran, the more swollen it became. Li Yundong wanted to tear all his clothes and then cut open his chest to let the qi in his body leak out. Li Yundong wanted to stop and let the qi in his body slowly calm down, but he suddenly remembered what Ziyuan had said, "Don't stop the first time you run. Run as far as you can until you can't stand it anymore." Li Yundong gritted his teeth and continued to run like this. After running for another 5 kilometers, Li Yundong was already out of the city. He began to feel hot all over, and each of the 36,000 pores on his body felt as if they were being pricked by needles. It was painful and itchy. Li Yundong couldn't help but feel a little shocked. He couldn't understand why such a situation was happening. But when he thought about the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor he had read, he unconsciously searched his mind for the knowledge in it to explain such a phenomenon. After thinking for a while, Li Yundong really couldn't stand the feeling of the manic heat surging in his body. His pores opened, and his body began to sweat. Go to see net. 7:ko/ As soon as he started sweating, Li Yundong suddenly felt that the stuffy feeling in his body had lessened a little. Li Yundong's spirit was greatly lifted. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. He seemed to understand why Ziyuan had asked him to run to cultivate his body. Every exercise will mobilize the primordial qi in the body to gather in these organs, making them constantly stronger. This principle was the same for people who learned to sing. Even if their voices were damaged in the beginning, it did not matter, because the vocal cords would become stronger and thicker the more they practiced. The internal organs of the human body also worked the same way. Li Yundong knew that at this time, the organs in his body were constantly wriggling, constantly replenishing the various organs with primordial qi. This kind of exercise was 100 times, or even 1,000 times stronger than that of ordinary people. With the medicinal power of Renyuan Jindan, Li Yundong's exercise for an hour was equivalent to that of ordinary people for a month. His exercise for a day was equivalent to that of ordinary people for a year. When Li Yundong ran like this for another 10,000 meters, he began to feel a dull growling sound coming from his stomach. At first, Li Yundong thought that he was hungry, but he soon realized that something was wrong. The sound in his stomach was getting louder and louder, and with every sound, he felt his body tremble. The sound was like rolling thunder in the distant sky, deep and dull, like the roar of a tiger or leopard in the depths of the mountains. Could this be the tiger-leopard thunder sound? A thought flashed through Li Yundong's mind. As a professional otaku, Li Yundong had been watching Jin Yong's Wuxia novels since the first year of high school. Even now, he was still a martial arts fan. Of course, he was no stranger to the tiger-leopard thunder sound. Li Yundong had once read The Lost Martial Arts World by Li Zhongshuan, the last disciple of Master Shang Yunxiang. In this book, Li Zhongshuan asked his master Shang Yunxiang, "What is the tiger-leopard thunder sound?" Shang Yunxiang picked up a cat and placed it in Li Zhongshuan's hands, saying, "This is the tiger-leopard thunder sound." Li Zhongshuan was instantly enlightened. Cats, leopards, and tigers were all feline animals. They all had one thing in common, and that was that their stomachs would constantly produce a low, deep sound. This sound was the sound of their internal organs constantly wriggling, like rolling thunder in the distant sky. That was why it was called the tiger-leopard thunder sound. The low, deep sound in Li Yundong's stomach was the state that most martial artists were unable to reach, the tiger-leopard thunder sound. Be it cultivators or martial artists, it would take years, or even decades, of painstaking effort to master the tiger-leopard thunder sound. It took only a day for Li Yundong to master it. While Li Yundong was shocked, he also sighed at the wonders of the Renyuan Jin Dan. Without the Renyuan Jin Dan, he would never have been able to master the tiger-leopard thunder sound. His internal organs were constantly wriggling, and Li Yundong could clearly feel his bones and muscles swelling. This feeling of swelling was not painful. Instead, it was full of power. Li Yundong could feel that the qi in his body was flowing rapidly at this time. Part of the qi was leaking out of his pores, excreting the excess qi, while the other part of the qi was driving his blood to flow quickly. The more Li Yundong ran, the more comfortable he felt. The more he ran, the more energized he felt. His running speed was comparable to that of a normal person sprinting for 100 meters. This terrifying speed shocked some of the passers-by on the road, and they almost caused a car accident. Suddenly, Li Yundong felt that perhaps this cultivation was not an extremely arduous journey. On the contrary, he was enjoying it, and he would never get tired of it. /om/ At first, it was like a rushing Yangtze River, but slowly, it became like high-pressure water gushing out from a pipe. The force was frightening. Even on the second day, he began to notice that he could control the opening and closing of his pores. He could control where he wanted to sweat and where he didn't want to sweat. After discovering this, Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He began to gradually close some of his pores to prevent the yuan qi in his body from leaking out. This undoubtedly increased the pressure in his body. The opening of the dam, which could originally pour out 1,000 cubic meters of water in a minute, was now reduced to only 500 cubic meters. The water pressure from this opening was naturally twice as strong as before. As the pressure increased, the impact on the meridians in his body naturally increased as well. The pressure on his internal organs also increased. For example, he originally had to withstand a pressure of 100 pascals, but now because of the increased pressure, he had to withstand a pressure of 200 pascals. This kind of sudden doubling of pressure was very similar to Sun Wukong's cultivation in the training ground in Dragon Ball, where the gravity was doubled. Although it was hard, the effect of cultivation was extremely obvious. When Li Yundong was running for the third day, his clothes had already been wet and dry. He had repeated this more than dozens of times, and his clothes were covered with sweat and salt stains. Watch net. 7 KOM. On the third day, Li Yundong could already control the pores all over his body. Only 10% of the pores were open for the qi to pour out. This meant that he could already adapt to the rolling qi under 10 times the pressure. Most importantly, during the continuous running, Li Yundong felt that the qi in his body was like a soldering iron that was constantly being beaten on a chopping board. The more it was beaten, the harder it was, and the more it was tempered, the stronger it was. His internal organs and 8 extraordinary meridians were also like a stronger and stronger dam, constantly increasing in height and thickness. It was not until the night of the 3rd day that Li Yundong felt that he had begun to overdraft. Only then did he slowly slow down and stop by the side of the road. Li Yundong closed his eyes and adjusted his qi a little. After calming down the rolling qi and blood in his body, he carefully looked around. He found that he had run at least hundreds of kilometers away and was already on the ground of another province. Li Yundong stretched his body and smiled. He walked off the highway and found a hidden place to sit cross-legged and meditate for the whole night. That night, when Li Yundong was meditating, he could clearly feel that the qi in his body was much stronger than before. Moreover, when the true qi in his body flowed, it was not as easy as it used to be to move his whole body, like a monstrous flood. Although the true qi in his body was as strong and majestic as before, this qi was not like before, which came like thousands of galloping horses and left like a chaotic army. Instead, it had become like a condensed long snake, iron chain, and steel whip. When it left, it was like a dragon swinging its tail, leaving no trace. It was like a ragtag army that, after going through training, had begun to become a well-trained and orderly regular army. When Li Yundong opened his eyes again, it was already dawn. He stretched lazily. When he passed the highway checkpoint, he saw someone selling lunch boxes on the side of the road. He used the little money he had on him to buy one. Fortunately, the food in the mainland was slightly cheaper than in the southern cities. It only cost 5 or 6 yuan. Li Yundong looked at Li Yundong, who was sitting at the checkpoint. After Li Yundong finished his meal, he tidied up his luggage and spent 2 yuan on 2 bottles of water. After that, he continued his journey. Li Yundong went through Jiangxi, Hunan, Sichuan, and finally arrived at the border of Tibet. It had been a whole month. During the past month, Li Yundong had been living in the open. He had even sold his mobile phone for money. All his money had been used to buy some dry food and clean drinking water. During the past month, Li Yundong had completely changed. In the past, Li Yundong had smooth skin, a handsome face, and a strong body. Although he did not pay much attention to his appearance, he was always well-dressed and clean. But now, because of the long exposure to the sun, Li Yundong's skin had become bronze. His clothes had become ragged and dirty, especially the white salt on his body, which could not be washed clean after several times. His clothes had become a little white, and the sneakers on his feet had long been worn out. He could no longer wear them, so he had to throw them away and become a pair of bare feet. Li Yundong ran barefoot all the way. At first, there were countless bloody blisters on his feet, which made him grimace in pain. But after a few days, these bloody blisters had become thick calluses, and he got used to walking barefoot. His hair had grown crazily in this month. His long hair had grown over his shoulders, and it was as messy as a chicken nest. His face was unshaven, and he had grown a full beard. At first glance, he looked like a savage who had just come out of the mountains. Although he had suffered for a month, during this month, Li Yundong could only open the Baihui acupoint on the top of his head to pour out his qi. At the same time, he closed all the pores on his body. The qi in his body had been condensed like a reinforced iron pillar, powerful and not dissipating. Li Yundong didn't even know to what extent the qi in his body had become at this time, nor did he know what kind of lethality and destructive power he would have when he condensed his qi and punched. The brown-haired foreigner was busy for a while. There were beads of sweat on his forehead. He looked up and shook his head helplessly. The female tour guide sighed and said to the girl, "I'm sorry, we can't do anything. He's gone." Although the girl already knew that the old man had passed away, she couldn't help but burst into tears when she heard the confirmation. Li Yundong frowned as he watched from the side of the road. He subconsciously wanted to go and have a look, but he remembered that Zi Yuan had once told him not to meddle in other people's business on the road. Thinking of this, he wanted to leave. Moreover, Li Yundong vaguely felt that someone in the crowd was coveting him. He glanced around and found a rover parked in the distance. A young man and a woman were sitting in the car, looking at him with bright eyes. When the young man and woman saw Li Yundong's gaze, they couldn't help but look away. This situation made Li Yundong frown. He subconsciously became vigilant in his heart and turned to leave. But as soon as he turned around and took 2 steps, the girl's sad cry came, making Li Yundong feel very uncomfortable. He suddenly remembered the scene of Su Chan crying in his arms. Li Yundong hesitated for a while and struggled in his heart for a long time. In the end, he sighed slightly, turned back, and walked toward the crowd. Li Yundong was dressed like a savage. Although he didn't smell, he looked very sloppy. The people around him avoided him, afraid to get close to him, as if he was a god of plague. Watch Net. 7 KOM. Li Yundong walked up to the old man and was about to reach out his hand when he heard the 2 foreigners shouting. The female tour guide also looked at him with disgust and said loudly, "Death is the most important thing. What are you doing?" After saving Hardadef and Chao Kefi, Li Yundong already had some experience in such things. He turned his head to look at the female tour guide and saw that the woman had a decent appearance and looked quite beautiful. He was too lazy to answer her. He continued to stretch out his hand and help the old woman sit up. The surrounding Tibetans burst into an uproar and began to criticize him loudly. However, most of them spoke in Tibetan, and Li Yundong couldn't understand a single word. However, the girl could tell from his dress that Li Yundong looked like a Han, so she shouted in Chinese full of hostility, "What are you doing? Don't touch Changbajila. His soul has gone to see the living Buddha. You can't touch his body like this." Li Yundong glanced at the girl, smiled, and didn't say anything. He reached out his hand and pressed it on the old man's head. A strong and condensed Yuanyang genuine qi surged into the old man's body. When the surrounding Tibetans saw Li Yundong's appearance, as if he looked down on all of them, they were all angry. Some of the young people even wanted to come over and fight. The 2 foreigners also looked frightened. How could that Han man be the living Buddha? Changbajila said loudly, "I was about to go to Elysium when he put his hand on my head and I came back to life. Even Master Jalila Tenzin can't do such a thing. If he's not the living Buddha, then what is he?" Changbajila's words made everyone look at each other in dismay. Their hearts began to waver. One of them said in a low voice, "Yeah, this guy just touched Changbajila's head, and Changbajila came back to life. This kind of method is too unimaginable. If he's not the living Buddha, then what is he? How can the living Buddha be a Han man? Oh, no matter what, I think Changbajila's life was saved by this Han man. Yes, I think this man is the living Buddha among the Han people." It was difficult to persuade these people. An old Tibetan looked at Changbajila and said, "Changbajila, you are the leader of our pilgrimage. You should tell us what to do." Changbajila's face showed an embarrassed expression. He thought to himself, "It stands to reason that we should catch up with him immediately and express our gratitude to our benefactor. However, pilgrims must bow every 3 steps on the pilgrimage journey. If we don't do this, it will be a great disrespect to Buddha, and we won't be able to escape to Elysium when we die. But if we bow every 3 steps, how can we catch up with this benefactor?" Changbajila looked embarrassed, but Meiduo said considerately, "Changbajila, I think he is also going to Kathoda Temple. He will definitely rest there for a while. Maybe he will still be there when we get there. Changbajila sighed and said, that's the only way. Let's go. 7 K.O.M. As he spoke, he turned his face again and kept lecturing Meiduo. Why didn't you stop him back then? Did you have a preconceived notion because he was a Han person and have other ideas in your heart? Meiduo glanced at Changbajila timidly and shook her head weakly. No, it's just that he's too dirty. Changbajila couldn't help but say angrily, I'm still dirty. I've been worshipping all the way here. Which part of me isn't dirty? Which part of you isn't dirty? D****, Buddha said that all living beings are equal, that there is no distinction between high and low, and that there is no distinction between beauty, ugliness, and cleanliness. As my disciple, how dare you say such a thing? Don't you know that Buddha used to beg along the street and was unkempt? Meiduo, a young and beautiful girl, was reprimanded by Changbajila in front of everyone. Her eyes immediately turned red, and tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't dare to refute. She just took Changbajila's hand and said softly, Changbajila, don't be angry. If we meet him later, I'll apologize to him. You've just recovered, so don't be angry. We can't do without you. Changbajila said angrily, what if we don't meet him? I'm telling you, if we don't meet him, you will have committed an evil deed, and there will be retribution in the future. Meiduo couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she had a strong personality. She turned around and secretly wiped her tears, not wanting anyone to see them. The Tibetans on the side tried to persuade him. Changbajila, don't talk about Meiduo anymore. You almost went to paradise before. You don't know how sad she was. Maybe we'll meet this Han person up ahead? Changbajila snorted and said, what if we don't meet him? The crowd looked at each other and kept silent. Changbajila stopped talking. He faced the direction of Mount Duonyen, put his palms together, raised them above his head, and knelt on the ground. Then, he kowtowed to the ground, touched his mouth, and prostrated himself on the ground. His heart touched the ground, and his whole body touched the ground. He completed the worship. When the Tibetans saw that he had started the pilgrimage, they followed him one after another. They knelt down every 3 steps as they walked toward the Kathoda temple halfway up the mountain. 2 foreigners who were climbing the mountain witnessed this scene. After listening to the translation of the female guide from China, they couldn't help but praise, what a magical country. What a magical pilgrim, what a magical living Buddha. The female guide, Wuxia, said with a dubious look, that scruffy man is a living Buddha? I don't believe it. One of the foreigners said, it doesn't matter whether he's a living Buddha or not. What's important is that he pressed his hand on the dead old man's head and the old man came back to life. It's really amazing. Wuxia, are all Chinese people so magical? Wuxia curled her lips and muttered in Chinese, who knows if he's just a blind cat running into a dead mouse. When the foreigner saw that she was speaking Chinese and he couldn't understand it, he shrugged helplessly and said to his companion, Hey, Jack, is your camera used as an ornament? Why didn't you take a picture of it just now? Jack said, Lubby, I didn't think of it. Don't worry, I'll take it out now. I won't turn it off again. Lubby smiled and said, then let's go all the way. I have a feeling that these people are going to cause trouble. Li Yunyang had no idea that a group of people was chasing him, but they were all in different ways. He had been crawling along the mountain path of Mount Duonyen. He had already gotten used to the weight of the fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms on his back. It was as light as a feather. Although he didn't run, even walking gave people the feeling that there was wind under his feet. The scenery on the side of the road kept passing behind him. When he was halfway up the mountain, Li Yunyang looked up and saw a magnificent temple standing in front of him. Under the golden sun, red palaces were densely packed like a forest. In this forest, the Naomi Sushiong Spirit Pagoda, known as the decoration of the snow mountain, was clustered in the middle of the palaces. Some of them even found a place to lie down and sleep. Only Changbajila sat alone on the steps outside the temple, looking at the golden plaque of the Kathuo temple uneasily. Because of what had happened during the day, Meiduo sat on the steps with Changbajila obediently. She hugged her knees with both hands and looked at the white moon in the sky with a pair of dark eyes. Meiduo, are you still blaming me for teaching you a lesson in front of so many people today? Changbajila suddenly said. Meiduo shook her head, and the little braids on her head swayed. The ornaments hanging on the braids also swayed. No, Changbajila, you're right. I shouldn't have looked at people like that. My cultivation is not enough. Changbajila looked at Meiduo lovingly. Just as he was about to speak, a figure suddenly flashed from a corner not far away. Meiduo also saw this scene and suddenly shivered. She stood up and shook Changbajila's arm excitedly. Changbajila, it's him, it's him. Changbajila was stunned. What do you mean? Meiduo said excitedly, it's the Han brother who saved you, /om/. Perhaps he believes in Central Plains Buddhism. This is different. Meiduo asked, is he a follower of Buddhism in the Central Plains? Changbajila thought about it and said, it's possible. Meiduo asked, then what is he doing here? Look at him, he seems to have walked here. The calluses on his feet are very thick. Changbajila smiled and said, Meiduo, you are very observant. Thinking of Li Yundong's strong body, which many Tibetan boys didn't have, Meiduo couldn't help but blush a little. She averted her eyes and changed the topic. Changbajila, what do you think he is doing here? Changbajila said, many Buddhists in the Central Plains, like us, also advocate asceticism, so there is a saying about ascetic monks. I guess this person is an ascetic monk. But speaking of this, Meiduo said, but he didn't shave his hair. Changbajila couldn't help frowning and said, maybe he cultivates with his hair? But I've never heard of an ascetic monk cultivating with his hair. As they were talking, the two of them suddenly heard a low sound of something breaking through the air. The girl and the old man looked at each other and slowed down to see what was going on. Seeing this, the two of them were immediately stunned. They saw a thin line of white mist emerging from the top of Li Yundong's head. Although it was night, it could still be seen with the naked eye. His chest rose and fell, and when he took a deep breath, Meiduo and Changbajila felt as if the air around them had been sucked away by this young man. Meiduo had sharp eyes. She nudged Changbajila with her elbow and then pointed to the ground. Changbajila looked down and was so shocked that his eyeballs almost fell out of their sockets. Go to the internet. 7 K.O.M. When Li Yundong took a deep breath, the sand and dust on the ground rolled toward him, as if he was a huge black hole. But when Li Yundong exhaled, a straight and thin white line sprayed out of his mouth. It flew more than 10 meters away, hit the red and black walls of the temple, and then scattered in all directions. The two of them were shocked by Li Yundong's abnormality. Suddenly, the qi in Li Yundong's body began to surge violently, as if there was a thunderstorm in the sky. Countless thunderbolts fell and began to fiercely attack Li Yundong's lower abdomen and lower dantian. Li Yundong knew that this was a situation where he had to enter the Zhuji phase in advance, but his current environment was not right, so he didn't dare to enter the Zhuji phase directly. He suddenly opened his eyes and instantly mobilized the surging qi in his body into his arms. Then, he jumped up, exhaled, and punched a hard rock 3 meters away. With a muffled bang, Meiduo and Changbajila felt the ground under their feet tremble slightly, as if an invisible giant had just stamped on the ground. The two of them didn't dare to breathe too loudly. They just watched as Li Yundong gradually withdrew his qi and then carried the tightly tied fan of 7 treasures on his back again. Then, they left the temple and continued to climb to the top of the mountain. Meiduo and Changbajila waited until Li Yundong was far away before they dared to come out. At the same time, they moved closer to the rock that Li Yundong had punched 3 meters away, which was as tall as a man. This rock was originally a treasure of the Kathuo temple, which was engraved with golden Sanskrit characters. Li Yundong had exhaled in the dark, so he didn't have time to identify it. He punched out and made a fist mark in the middle of the treasure of the temple. Meiduo and Changbajila took a closer look and saw that there was a clear fist mark on the stone. With the bright moonlight, they could even see the clear and recognizable skin lines in the fist mark. Around the fist mark, the stone wall was extremely smooth, as if someone had deliberately skimmed it with a file. Meiduo and Changbajila looked at each other. Both of them were so shocked that they couldn't control themselves. Meiduo said, "God of heaven! This Han brother is too powerful." Changbajila also murmured excitedly, "Mahagala, this must be the reincarnation of Mahagala." While one of them was shocked and the other was excited, a cold cough suddenly came from behind them. Meiduo was startled and quickly turned around, only to see a boy standing in front of her. Although his hair had been washed, it was still messy and draped over his shoulders. The beard on his face almost covered his appearance. It was Li Yundong, who had returned. Li Yundong looked at Meiduo and Changbajila warily and asked in a deep voice, "Why are you following me?" At this time, Changbajila turned around and knelt down excitedly. He threw himself on the ground, the backs of his hands touching the ground, and his palms facing the sky. He said piously, "Mahagala, thank you for saving my life." Li Yundong's vigilance dropped slightly. He bowed slightly and made a gesture of bending down to support him. "You're welcome. It was just a small effort." Changbajila got up from the ground, turned his head, and glared at Meiduo, who was looking at Li Yundong curiously. He said in a low voice, "Why are you in a daze?" In Meiduo's eyes, the boy was not very tall, but his shoulders gave people a strong and burly feeling. Although his hair was messy and his face was covered with a beard, making him look like he was in his 40s or 50s, his eyes were as bright as the stars in the sky, and his voice didn't sound much older than hers. "Just how old is this Han brother?" "He doesn't seem to be much older than me, but why is he so powerful? Is it really as Changbajila said? Is he really the reincarnation of Mahagala?" Meiduo thought to herself. When she heard Changbajila's low scolding, she immediately came to her senses. Chapter 175. Go to watch net. The Kathuo monastery was very quiet late at night. The voices of Li Yunyang, Changbajila, and Meiduo attracted the attention of the lamas guarding the monastery. 2 patrolling lamas carrying lanterns spotted them and shouted, "Who's there?" The 2 lamas spoke in Tibetan. Changbajila also replied in Tibetan, "It's me, Chiangba, a friend of Abbot Danba. Watch net. 7 KOM." The 2 lamas walked closer with lanterns in their hands and immediately laughed. "Changbajila, it's you. What are you doing here so late at night?" "Hey, Meiduo, you're here too." Meiduo greeted the 2 young lamas with a smile. The 2 lamas looked at Li Yundong in confusion and asked, "Who is this? What is he doing here so late?" Changbajila smiled and said, "This is my savior." One of the slightly taller young lamas laughed. "Oh, I know. I've heard about this. Changbajila, is he the living Buddha of the Han family who saved you from Elysium?" "It doesn't look like it." Changbajila chuckled and said, "Buddha said that all living beings are equal. People can't be judged by their nobility or their appearance. Mima, don't look at him like this. He's very powerful. The young Lama called Mima laughed and said, "Of course, I don't have the ability to bring the dead back to life." Li Yundong saw that they had been talking in Tibetan, and he couldn't understand a word, so he couldn't help asking Meiduo, "What are you talking about?" Meiduo smiled and said, "We are talking about you. Mima and Pu Qiong don't believe that you saved Changbagra." Li Yundong smiled and said, "It doesn't matter. As long as they don't blame me for breaking into the temple in the middle of the night." Who would have thought that Mima could understand Mandarin? "Did you barge into the temple on your own?" he asked in Mandarin. Li Yundong thought to himself, F***ck. Why would I send myself to the muzzle of a gun for no reason? Could these two lamas understand Mandarin? He groaned inwardly, but he forced himself to nod and said, "Actually, I've been staying in the temple and haven't gone out, so it can't be considered trespassing." Watch net. Rainbow ** literature _learning% super #fast. Update. Another lama, Pu Qiong, who had been silent all this while, also said in stiff Mandarin, "You can't spend the night in Kathuo Monastery without permission." Li Yundong knew that it was his fault, so he didn't embarrass the two lamas. He nodded and said, "Well, I'll leave in a while." Changbajila was shocked and hurriedly stopped Li Yundong, who was about to leave. He said sincerely, "Han brother, you are my savior. We Tibetans have no reason to drive our benefactor away. This is ungrateful. Wait here for a moment. The abbot, Danba, is a good friend of mine. I'll go talk to him. You can definitely stay here for the night." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Changbajila, it doesn't matter. I'm going to hurry through the night." Changbajila opened his hands to stop Li Yundong from going over. He said, "Han boy, you insist on leaving. Aren't you making me feel bad? In the future, if others know that I can't even repay my savior, what will they think of me?" Meiduo also tried to persuade him. "Yes, Han brother, although you didn't get lost after a long journey, this plateau is not like the inland. There are roads and signs everywhere. It's easy to get lost on the plateau here. You'd better wait until dawn and go with us." Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He secretly felt that Meiduo's words made sense, so he couldn't help but ponder. Seeing that he was tempted, Changbajila hurriedly said, "I'll go find the abbot." "Han brother, wait here. You must wait for my news." As he spoke, he winked at Meiduo, indicating that she must stop Li Yundong and not let him go. Meiduo nodded gently to show that she understood. Only then did Changbajila feel relieved. He waved to Mima and Pu Qiong and said, "You two, take me to see Abbot Danba. Hurry up." The two young lamas glanced at Li Yundong and hesitated, but they couldn't resist Changbajila's urging, so they turned around and left with the old man. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. Meiduo watched them leave and said with a smile, "Brother Han, don't worry. Changbajila and Abbot Danba have a very good relationship. When they were young, they became sworn brothers." Li Yundong smiled and said, "I'm not worried. If it comes down to it, I can sleep outside for a night. Anyway, that's how I've been doing for the past month." Meiduo involuntarily looked at Li Yundong's bare feet and said, "Brother Han, did you walk all the way here on your feet? Where did you come from?" Li Yundong looked at her and smiled. "Have you heard of Tiannan City?" Meiduo exclaimed, "I know. This is a very, very far city. It's more than 2,000 kilometers away." Li Yundong was a little surprised. "You know Tiannan City?" Meiduo smiled proudly and said, "I'm very good at geography. I've always been in the top 3 in all my subjects in school. Don't look down on me." Li Yundong chuckled and said, "I wouldn't dare. You're much better than me." Meiduo giggled. She opened her mouth to speak, but suddenly found that she couldn't find a topic to talk about. She rolled her eyes and asked again, "Well, Brother Han, can you tell me how old you are? You must be working already, right?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "I'm still in college. I'm only 20 years old." Mei Duo said in surprise, "Really? You seem to be in your 30s. I didn't expect you to be only 2 years older than me. Are you a college student?" I'm also going to take the college entrance exam next year." Li Yundong smiled and followed her topic of conversation. "Which university do you want to go to?" Mei Duo had long had her favorite university in mind, but she suddenly rolled her eyes and said slyly, "I don't know yet." "By the way, Brother Han, which university are you going to?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "Tiannan University, just a third-rate university. It's not worth mentioning." Mei Duo didn't know that Li Yundong was telling the truth. She knew that Han people had always been modest and introverted, so she thought that Li Yundong was being modest. She smiled and said, "How about I go to your university?" As she spoke, her heart suddenly began to beat wildly. Her ears turned red, and although there was shyness in the corners of her eyes, her gaze was burning and extremely bold. Li Yundong didn't notice Mei Duo's gaze, nor did he notice that Mei Duo's words were actually a kind of hidden test. He laughed and said, "Didn't I say that this school is not good? You are so excellent. If you go there, wouldn't it be a waste of talent?" Mei Duo was stunned. She didn't know what Li Yundong meant by this. Was he rejecting her, or did he mean something else? She thought for a long time and felt that his words were neither a promise nor a refusal. She was unwilling to give up. She opened her mouth and wanted to test him again, but she was really a little shy in her heart. She couldn't open her mouth no matter how hard she tried. A 17-year-old Tibetan girl was facing a 20-year-old Han man in the middle of the night. Her heart was in a mess. After struggling for a long time, Mei Duo couldn't help but complain in her heart, "No wonder people say that Han people have a lot of tricks in their hearts. Today, I see that it's really true. If it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. How annoying." Li Yundong didn't know that the little girl had already complained in his heart. He saw that Mei Duo had lowered her head and was silent for a while, so he didn't take the initiative to talk to her. He just sighed in his heart, "This girl is really like Su Chan. I wonder where she is now and what she is doing. Is she thinking about me?" When Mei Duo saw that Li Yundong didn't take the initiative to talk to her, she felt even more resentful in her heart. "There are so many young men who come to talk to me on weekdays. Why is this Han brother so arrogant that he doesn't even want to take the initiative to talk to me?" Mei Duo felt a little embarrassed and wanted to leave, but her feet seemed to be rooted to the ground and she didn't move at all. While the two of them were talking to each other, Changbajila found the backyard of the temple, where Abbot Danba lived. Before he entered the room, he shouted, "Danba, are you asleep? If you are, get up quickly." As he said this, he turned to Mima and Pu Qiong and said, "All right, it's none of your business. You can go first." Mima and Pu Qiong were supposed to lead the way for Changbajila, but as the three of them walked, Changbajila's pace became faster and faster. The old horse knew the way, so it didn't take long for him to walk ahead of them. Mima and Pu Qiong looked at each other, smiled bitterly, shook their heads, and left. Not long after, the wooden door creaked open, and an old man wearing a red frock and a yellow cassock walked out. The old man's eyebrows were very long, and his face was full of wrinkles. As soon as he saw Changbajila, he couldn't help sighing and saying, "Qiangba, it's so late. What are you making a fuss about here? Aren't you afraid of disturbing Buddha?" Changbajila was shocked. He first bowed respectfully to the position of Buddha in the temple, then anxiously pulled Danba's arm and said, "I have something urgent to talk to you about." Danba smiled bitterly and said, "Why haven't you changed your impatience after decades? What is it?" As soon as Changbajila told him what had happened, Danba laughed and said, "It turns out that you have found your savior. Where is he? Take me to see him quickly. I also want to see what the master who can pull you back from the Elysium looks like." As he spoke, he was about to leave, even more anxious than Changbajila. However, Changbajila grabbed Danba's arm and refused to let him go. He said, "No, you have to promise me first that he will stay here for the night." Danba smiled and said, "Is this a thing? I promise, I promise." As he spoke, he was about to leave again, but Changbajila pulled him back again and said, "Don't worry, I still have something to tell you." Danba smiled bitterly and said, "What else?" Changbajila said seriously, "This Han man saved my life. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have been able to complete this pilgrimage. But I don't have anything to thank him with, so I want to borrow something from you." Danba immediately became vigilant. "What do you want to borrow?" Changbajila said, "The Mahamudra Secret Sutra, /om/." Chapter 176. Go to Watch Net. As soon as Danba heard that Changbajila wanted to borrow the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra, he immediately shook his head like a rattle. No, how is this borrowing? It's clear that you won't return it. Besides, how can such an important thing be passed on to an outsider?" Changbajila said unhappily, "Danba, you promised to give me a copy last time. Why are you going back on your word now? Just take it as giving me what you promised to give me in advance. You don't have to worry about who I give it to." Danba still shook his head. "No, this Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra is the most precious treasure of the Kathuo Monastery. It can't be passed down to the Han people. Go to Watch Net." Changbajila sneered. "Danba, are you bullying me as an outsider? Do you think I don't know that you have printed a lot of Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra and are selling them as souvenirs?" Danba's face was slightly red, but he couldn't see it clearly in the dark. He argued, "That's an incomplete copy. Even if it gets out, it's not a big deal. No one can understand anything from this incomplete copy." Changbajila said, "Yes, you yourself said that it's an incomplete copy, and outsiders can't understand it. But even if you give me an original copy, without the teachings of a master, how can outsiders really learn the kung fu of Mahamudra? This Han man saved my life by chance. If I can't even take out a decent gift, what will others say about me if it gets out in the future?" Danba hesitated. He thought for a moment, then sighed and said, "Wait here for a moment." Changbajila was overjoyed. Okay, I'll wait for you here." After a while, Danba came out of the house with a beautifully wrapped book as thick as a pinky finger. He handed it over and said, "Here you are." Changbajila took it, flipped through a few pages, and suddenly became furious. He raised his head and said angrily, "Danba, I treated you as my best friend in vain. How dare you fool me with an incomplete copy of a souvenir?" As he spoke, Changbajila threw the book to the ground and shouted, "From now on, you are no longer my friend." Seeing that he was about to leave angrily, Danba hurriedly pulled him back and sighed, "Hey, don't be in such a hurry, I want to give you this book." Changbajila saw him take out a thread-bound book with a yellowish cover. He took it and flipped through a few pages. His face lit up with joy. That's it. Danba, thank you very much." Danba sighed, "Forget it, as long as you don't scold me." As he spoke, he squatted down, picked up the remnant book on the ground, and patted the dust off it. Changbajila was in a good mood, so he joked, "Why are you still boasting so cleanly? Aren't these books everywhere in your temple?" Danba snorted. "If you don't become the abbot, you won't know how much the monastery consumes. This book can still be sold." Changbajila smiled and shook his head. "You really only care about money. By the way, aren't you going to see that Han guy with me? Are you leaving now? Danba had been forced by Changbajila to take away an extremely precious esoteric canon. At this time, he was depressed, and even his desire to see Li Yundong had diminished a lot. He said listlessly, "Lead the way. I'll go and have a look." "Let's go." Changbajila laughed and carefully hid the book in his chest, then strode forward to lead the way. He walked as fast as he could, and his health surprised Danba. "I know about Changbajila's health. Last year, he was sick. How did he become so healthy all of a sudden?" Changbajila was afraid that Meiduo wouldn't be able to stop Li Yundong, so he couldn't help but walk faster and faster. In the end, he was almost jogging. Although Danba was about the same age as him, he hadn't been soaked in Li Yundong's vigorous Yuanyang genuine qi, so he couldn't keep up with him. He could only keep shouting at Changbajila to slow down. After walking for a few minutes, Changbajila finally saw Li Yundong at a glance. He laughed happily from a distance and said, "Han Guy, I'm here." When Li Yundong saw him, he also smiled. Meiduo was sulking because Li Yundong hadn't talked to her. As soon as she saw Changbajila, she smiled happily and greeted him. "Changbajila, have you finished talking?" As she spoke, she unconsciously looked behind him and was suddenly stunned. "Abbot Danba, why are you here?" Abbot Danba was panting as he walked. He smiled and said, "I came to see Qiangba's savior." Is that him?" Danba looked at Li Yundong, and Meiduo nodded with a smile. "Yes, it's him." Danba was shocked when he saw him. He thought to himself, "This Han man's eyes are bright and sharp like a knife. Moreover, the power he exudes is no weaker than that of the guardian of the holy mountain. He's not an ordinary person. He's clearly a cultivator. I thought he was just an ordinary person who was proficient in medicine. I didn't think he could understand the cultivation book of the esoteric sect, so I agreed. Why did Xiangba want to give him the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra? Nonsense, it's really nonsense." But he had already promised to give the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra to Xiangba, so it was not appropriate for him to ask for it back. He could only hope that Li Yundong would refuse so that he could ask for it back. Go to the internet. Changbajila didn't know what Danba was thinking. He walked up to Li Yundong and enthusiastically introduced them to each other. "This is my good friend, Master Danba, the abbot of the Kathuo Temple. Danba, this is my savior, Li Yundong." Li Yundong nodded with a smile, and Danba also forced a smile and put his palms together in return. Changbajila took out the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra from his bosom and respectfully handed it to Li Yundong with both hands. He said seriously, "Han boy, this is a little token of my appreciation. Please accept it." Li Yundong was stunned. He saw that it was a thread-bound book with a Buddha statue on the cover and a line of golden Sanskrit characters. He muttered in his heart, "What is this? Should I accept it? Isn't it popular among Tibetans to give hada?" Meiduo, who was standing to one side, saw his hesitation and advised, "Han brother, just accept it. You saved Changbajila's life, so it's not a big deal to accept this little gift. If you don't accept it, Changbajila will be very sad." Li Yundong glanced at her and felt that it might not be a precious gift, so he nodded with a smile and accepted it. Danba was going crazy watching from the side. He wanted to beat his chest and stamp his feet. "Meiduo, why are you so talkative? Do you know what that is?" Seeing Li Yundong accept it, Danba stuffed it into his bosom without looking at it, looking as if he didn't take it seriously. He was even more resentful in his heart. This kind of esoteric method is hard to get, but you actually treat it as weeds on the side of the road and don't take it seriously at all. Damn it. But on second thought, he thought, well, since you don't take it seriously, that's even better. When I find a chance to take it back, you won't be very sad. Danba made up his mind. He smiled and chatted with Li Yundong for a while, then found an opportunity to say goodbye and returned to his room. After returning to his room, Danba called over a patrolling lama who had passed by the house and said, "Go and get Dorji Tenzin for me." The lama nodded and turned to leave. After a while, a tall monk dressed in a yellow and red lama robe strode in. The monk's robe exposed his left hand, where the muscles were bulging, and his skin glowed like steel under the moonlight. The village chief's hair grew on his head, each strand like a steel nail. He had tiger eyes and a lion's nose, and his appearance was extremely fierce. When Dorji Tenzin saw Danba, who was 2 heads shorter than him, he bowed respectfully and said, "Abbot Danba, what can I do for you?" Danba told him the whole story, sighed, and said, "I thought that he was just a Han man who was proficient in medicine. I thought that even if I gave him the book, he wouldn't be able to understand it. But I never expected that this person would turn out to be a cultivator from the Central Plains. If such a person gets the book of our esoteric sect, he must be like a fish in water, like a tiger with wings. This is a big deal, and it may endanger the safety of our esoteric sect in the future." Dorji Tenzin raised his head and asked, "Abbot Danba, do you want me to kill that person?" Danba quickly shook his head and said, "No, no, we are all monks. How can we commit such a sin that will send us to hell? I'm also at fault in this matter. I shouldn't have agreed to Changba's request. Just help me get this book back." Dorji Tenzin nodded. There was no expression on his face, and his eyebrows were as deep as the sea. He didn't ask about the strength of his opponent, so he nodded and said, "Okay, I understand." As he spoke, he turned around and was about to leave. Danba hurriedly stopped him and warned, "Don't act rashly. You must wait until he is separated from Changba and the others. You must not let Changba know. Do you understand?" Dorji Tenzin nodded, but Danba still felt a little worried. He said, "By the way, although you are the guardian of our Kathuo monastery and one of the 18 guardian Vajras of the Holy Mountain, don't underestimate your opponent. Don't kill him, don't hurt him. Just take the scripture back. If he is willing to return it himself, that will be even better. Do you understand?" Dorji Tenzin frowned slightly and asked, "What if he refuses?" Danba sighed and said, "If he refuses, then we can only rob him." Dorji Tenzin nodded and said, "I understand. Abbot Danba, is there anything else? If not, I'll leave first." Danba smiled and said, "Go and have a rest. It's all right." When the night passed, Danba woke up. He wanted to ask Changbajila about the route of their pilgrimage, but when he arrived at the residence of Changbajila and the others, he found that they had set off early in the morning before the sky had even brightened. Danba was about to ask the lama next to him to find Dorji Tenzin and ask him to catch up with them quickly, but he suddenly found that the lamas in the temple were pointing at a stone that was as tall as a person next to the temple. Some tourists who had come to burn incense early in the morning were constantly marveling at the stone, and some were even scrambling to take pictures next to it. Danba walked over curiously and asked, "What are you looking at?" One of the lamas turned around and saw that it was Abbot Danba. He immediately saluted and said, "Abbot Danba, come and see, it's so strange here." Danba took a look and saw that the stone, which was carved with scriptures, had a clear fist mark, and the outline of the fist was as clear as if it had been cut by a machine. Danba sucked in a breath of cold air. "Who did this?" A lama said, "I don't know. I passed by here yesterday evening when the temple was closed. It was still fine." Mima, the monk who had been patrolling last night, suddenly said, "By the way, it seems that only Changbajila, Meiduo, and that Han man stayed here last night." "That Han man?" Danba was shocked. He quickly leaned forward and looked at the fist mark carefully. The more he looked at it, the more shocked he became. A few lamas next to him said with a smile, "Last night, I heard from Meiduo that this fist mark was made by that Han man, and it was made from a distance of 3 meters. A Lama shook his head and said, making such a fist mark from 3 meters away? That's impossible, absolutely impossible. Even Dorji Tenzin couldn't have done it. Another Lama said with a smile, Meiduo is a child. She likes to exaggerate. Chapter 178. Go to watch net. Meiduo and Li Yundong sat on the cart that was moving slowly. Although the road was long, Meiduo translated the words in the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra to Li Yundong word by word. It could be considered that she had found something to do. Li Yundong memorized the words that Meiduo had translated while thinking about the meaning in his heart. He didn't feel that time was passing slowly. Go to watch net. According to Meiduo's translation, the book was divided into 3 volumes and 3 parts. The first volume was the Ganges Mahamudra, which recorded the cultivation methods of the 3 Mahamudra, the Kongla Mahamudra, and the Light Mahamudra. After Meiduo finished translating the volume, Li Yundong fell into deep thought. Although the first volume introduced the 3 kinds of Mahamudra, in fact, it was more about the cultivation of Buddhism and the cultivation techniques of Buddhism. It did not involve the most critical problem, the problem of fighting. Cultivation was the same as martial arts. There were 3 different levels: talking, practicing, and fighting. Some people were just good at talking and fooling others. Instead, they became high officials of the sports commission and had disciples all over the world. However, this kind of person only talked but did not practice. They had no kung fu at all, let alone actual combat. There were also some people who only knew how to practice, and what they practiced was kung fu for health. The reason why martial arts were the quintessence of the country was not how strong their fighting skills were, but that it was the only fighting skill in the world that combined health and fighting skills. Some masters lacked fighting experience. They were very good at practicing, but once they entered the actual combat, they would not be able to do it. There were also some people who only knew how to fight. All their kung fu was developed in actual combat, and they were very powerful. However, people who knew how to fight could drown in the river and heroes who fell from the horse. If these people who knew how to fight did not know how to take care of themselves, it was easy for them to practice to death. Therefore, most of them did not live long. Along the way of cultivation, Li Yundong had thought about this problem many times. He found that at present, what he lacked the most was fighting skills. How should he fight when he met an enemy? In the past, when Li Yundong met Lin Youfa, he could still fight with him. But when he met Yuan Hongling, if it weren't for the fact that the boy Yuanyang blood in his body happened to restrain her, he would have died at that time. Especially after meeting Ao Wushuang, he was even more shocked by her amazing magic. He had no idea how to deal with this kind of magic. Su Chan and Zi Yuan, the 2 women that Li Yundong had come into contact with, were both good at talking, practicing, and fighting. While they were talking enthusiastically, Changbajila suddenly ran over from the front of the group and shouted, "Something happened ahead. Hurry up and help." Changbajila's prestige was extremely high. As soon as he spoke, the Tibetan young men followed him. Li Yundong, who was sitting in the back of the cart and secretly thinking about the mantra Mahamudra, saw this scene. He suddenly asked, "By the way, why do some of you call him Changbajila, but he calls himself Qiangba? Is his surname Qiangba, or is his surname Qiangba and his name Jela?" Meiduo giggled, and her voice was as moving as a silver bell. "We Tibetans don't have surnames, only names. Qiangba is his name, and Jela means old man. Sometimes the names of Tibetans are repeated, so we add one or two other words at the back or front to distinguish them. Li Yundong laughed and said, I see. What about you? What does Meiduo mean? Meiduo's cheeks were slightly red, and she said proudly, Meiduo means the flowers blooming on the plateau. Li Yundong smiled and said, you deserve this name. Meiduo looked at Li Yundong with burning eyes and asked, really? Do you think I'm beautiful? Li Yundong was suddenly moved by Meiduo's gaze. For the first time, he realized Meiduo's affection for him. He muttered to himself, this girl, is she interested in me? Li Yundong didn't want to respond to Meiduo's enthusiasm. He changed the topic, pointed to a group of people not far away, and said, what's going on over there? Meiduo was a little disappointed. She straightened up, looked up, and said, I don't know, but won't we know when we go over and have a look? As she said this, she boldly grabbed Li Yundong's hand, jumped out of the car, and said to him with a smile, hurry up, let's go to the front and have a look. Li Yundong hadn't expected Meiduo to be so bold. He subconsciously pulled back, but Meiduo's hand was clenched so tightly that he couldn't move it. He was too embarrassed to force it out again, for fear of hurting this young and beautiful girl. The two of them held hands and ran forward quickly. When the Tibetans saw them holding hands, they began to whisper to each other. However, Meiduo ignored the surrounding gazes and squeezed into the crowd with Li Yundong. Li Yundong took a closer look and saw that it was a jeep. The rear wheel was deeply stuck in a muddy pit. Two foreigners were pushing the car hard in front of it, and a group of Tibetan young men were pushing the car hard behind it. Beside this group of people stood a beautiful black-haired woman. It was Wuxia, the Chinese tour guide he had met once before. It's them? Li Yundong was stunned for a moment and recognized the two foreigners. It was summer on the Qinghai, Tibet plateau, and the road was not well repaired. For some reason, the jeep had gotten stuck in the muddy pit on the side of the road. No matter how hard the Tibetan young men and the two foreigners tried, the jeep could not be pushed out. Meiduo couldn't help but say to Li Yundong, why don't you go and help? Li Yundong nodded. Okay. When the Tibetan young men who were pushing the car saw Meiduo holding Li Yundong's hand tightly, they immediately became jealous. When Li Yundong came over, they stood up at the same time and stopped pushing. They all stepped aside, wanting to let Li Yundong push the car alone and see him make a fool of himself. /om/ Chapter 179. Go to watch net. When Meiduo saw that these people were making things difficult for Li Yundong, she couldn't help but be furious. However, she couldn't speak ill of her own people in front of so many outsiders. She just felt indignant and worried for Li Yundong, for fear that he would be embarrassed. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. Instead, he nodded and smiled at these Tibetans in a friendly manner. Then he took a deep breath, and a stream of qi surged up from his dantian. He lifted the chassis of the jeep with both hands, and with a loud shout, he lifted the car with both hands. The surrounding crowd suddenly let out a shocked uproar. The two foreigners were stunned until Li Yundong shouted at them, "Hey, what are you waiting for?" Only then did they react and push the car in front of them. The rear tire of the jeep was no longer stuck in the pit. With a push from the two foreigners, the car was pushed forward. Li Yundong also carried the car through the mud pit, and then put it down. His face did not change, and his heart did not beat fast. Wuxia, who was standing to one side, took off the big sunglasses on her face in shock and looked at Li Yundong with her mouth agape, as if she couldn't believe that this disheveled and sloppily dressed man had such divine strength. F***ck, it's impossible, isn't it? Wuxia said, stuttering. The foreigner beside her also said with a face full of shock, "It's amazing, it's really amazing. I didn't expect to meet this amazing Chinese man here. Lu, are all the people in your country so amazing? At this time, Lu Xia was speechless. For the first time, he had touched an old man who had been diagnosed as dead with his hand and saved him. The second time was even more exaggerated. So many young and strong men had pushed a cart, but it had not been pushed out of the mud pit. However, Li Yundong had pushed the cart out of the mud pit alone. If he wasn't a god, what was he? Not only Lu Xia, but all the Tibetans who saw this scene regarded Li Yundong as a celestial being for a moment. Those young Tibetans who had tried to challenge Li Yundong at night looked at each other with horror and fear in their eyes. Duo Gu, do you still want to challenge him? Are you kidding me? He's so strong. How can he compete with him? Where did this guy come from? He's too strong. Yeah, he's like a reincarnated King Kong. He's amazing. When Li Yundong returned to Meiduo, her face was also flushed with excitement. Her eyes were full of worship and admiration. She kept shouting, Mahagala, Mahagala. Li Yundong smiled in confusion and said, what are you talking about? When Meiduo saw that Li Yundong was in the limelight, and that some of her compatriots, who had been very resistant to him before, were now convinced and looking at him with fear in their eyes, she became more and more proud and happy, as if she had done something amazing. She said with a smile, Mahagala means guardian Vajra. It means that you are very strong. Li Yundong laughed and said, it's just a small trick. But the Mahamudra you translated for me may be the real amazing Kung Fu. At this time, the sky had gradually darkened. The two foreigners who were climbing the mountain did not continue their journey. They also stayed in the temporary camp of the Tibetan people. Watch net. Rainbow ** literature _learning % super #speed. Update. The Tibetans were hospitable. When they saw outsiders, they warmly took out their own brewed Highland barley wine and cheese to entertain them. The Westerners were also open-minded, unlike the Eastern Han, who were introverted. After the two of them drank a bowl of wine, they immediately shouted and became very happy. Some of the Tibetans even surrounded the bonfire and sang and danced. Of course, the one who attracted the most attention at the banquet was Meiduo. After dancing a few times in the field, she suddenly found that Li Yundong did not attend the bonfire party. Curious, she found an excuse and walked toward the tent that the Tibetans had temporarily set up for Li Yundong. When Meiduo lifted the curtain of Li Yundong's tent, she suddenly lifted the curtain like a prank and shouted, "What are you doing?" But as soon as she finished speaking, her face fell because Li Yundong was not in the tent. Meiduo was very disappointed and muttered in her heart, "Where on earth did this Han brother go? Why didn't he come to such a lively party? What a disappointment." Just as she was about to turn around and leave, she suddenly heard a low voice coming from afar. The voice was vague and indistinct. Meiduo was shocked. Why does it sound so much like a wolf? Wolves were not uncommon on the Qinghai, Tibet plateau. Meiduo immediately became nervous and vigilant. She turned around and ran quickly to Changbajila, whispering, "Changbajila, I think I heard the sound of a wolf." Changbajila was not only a devout believer, but also an old hunter. When he heard this, he immediately became vigilant and narrowed his eyes. "Where is it? Take me to have a look." As the spiritual leader of this group of people, he moved and attracted the attention of the others. Someone immediately asked, "Changbajila, what happened?" Changbajila laughed and said, "It seems that there are wolf cubs coming. Everyone, be alert and take out your shotguns." At this time, no one was in the mood to sing and dance. They stood up one after another. For a moment, the men rushed into the tent to get their own shotguns and weapons, and the women also held long knives and iron pots in their hands. No one was empty. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. After listening to Lu Xia's translation, the two foreigners saw that they were going to fight wolves, so they were very excited and wanted to follow them to watch the fun. The group of people ran noisily toward the place that Meiduo had mentioned. With this shout, the faint golden light emitted from Li Yundong's body suddenly became more vigorous. Then he pushed the handprint in his hand forward, and suddenly a golden handprint of Vairocana Mahavarakana flew straight out. It grew bigger and bigger in the dark night, and finally disappeared into the distant night sky. Changbajila was stunned, and his heart was shaking wildly. He was more and more sure that Li Yundong was the reincarnation of Mahagala. He looked back and saw that the clansmen were also staring at Li Yundong, who was not far away, with their mouths agape. They saw that every time Li Yundong whispered a mantra, he would spit out a golden handprint. This golden mudra was as clear as a movie projection. It was shining with golden light, and it was as majestic as the Buddha. Li Yundong hadn't gone to the party before because he wanted to confirm what he had thought during the day. As soon as he confirmed it, it was just as he had imagined. This mudra really needed to be matched with the mantra to be effective. But what Li Yundong didn't know was that in fact, this Mahamudra and mantra could only be used by cultivators with strong Zhenqi in order to have the power to subdue demons. Li Yundong was originally a Taoist cultivator, but the first fighting method he had inadvertently learned was Buddhist Kung Fu. This had to be said to be a joke of fate. Changbajila and the others watched as Li Yundong struck out one Mahamudra after another. The dark sky seemed to be illuminated by his golden Mahamudra. They were so shocked that they trembled all over. Unable to control themselves, they immediately knelt on the ground and prostrated themselves in worship. It wasn't until Li Yundong made the 18th Mahamudra that he felt that his Zhenqi was a little weak, so he stopped. After running his qi for a while, he slowly stood up. When Li Yundong stood up and turned his head, he was shocked to see a large group of people kneeling not far behind him. These people were worshipping him as if they were worshipping a god. Li Yundong walked over, pulled Meiduo up, and asked in a low voice, "What are you doing?" Meiduo stared at Li Yundong with her big flashing eyes. She said with awe and worship, "Are you really the reincarnation of Mahagala?" Li Yundong smiled bitterly and said, "What nonsense are you talking about?" Meiduo said excitedly, "Don't deny it. We all saw it just now. You must be the reincarnation of Mahagala, right?" Li Yundong shook his head and said, "No, absolutely not." Seeing that he was denying it so completely and firmly, Meiduo couldn't help but feel a little surprised and doubtful. A Tibetan who didn't understand their Chinese couldn't help but urge them anxiously, "Meiduo, what are you talking about?" Meiduo turned to her clansman and said, "He said that he is not the reincarnation of Mahagala." The clansmen whispered to each other, "How could he not be the reincarnation of Mahagala?" By the way, the Han people may not understand the meaning of Mahagala in our Tibetan language. Meiduo, can you explain to him what Mahagala means? Meiduo said loudly, "I've explained it, but he just won't admit it." There was obvious disappointment on the faces of these Tibetan people. They said one after another, "Impossible, this person must be our guardian Vajra. I've never seen anyone use the Mahamudra like this. If he's not the guardian Vajra, then what is he?" "Not necessarily. This person is Han, and there are also Buddhists among the Han people, but they are different from us. They are not called Vajra, but Arhat. This kind of ability is also called Shentong. I think he is the Shentong Arhat of the Han people. No matter what he is, this person is definitely here to protect us. Otherwise, why would he meet us? Why did he save Changbajila? We have to try our best to keep him here." "Keep him here? How? He's a Han from the Central Plains. What can we do to keep him here?" "Actually, it's not impossible to keep this Han person." As everyone was talking, a thought suddenly flashed through their minds, and their eyes fell on Meiduo. == The third update, /om/. Chapter 180. Go to watch net. When Meiduo saw that everyone's eyes were on her, her heart was as clear as a mirror. Her face suddenly turned red. She stamped her feet in shame and annoyance and said angrily, "Why are you all looking at me?" As she spoke, she covered her face, turned around, and ran away. Watch net. 7:ko/ As the Tibetans watched Meiduo leave, they all burst into laughter. They knew that Li Yundong didn't understand Tibetan, so they said to Changbajila unscrupulously, "Changbajila, you have to find a way to persuade Meiduo." Changbajila laughed and kept stroking his white beard with his hand. "There's no need for me to persuade her. Meiduo is more impatient than we are." After saying that, the crowd burst into laughter. At this time, Meiduo, who was running back to the camp, became even more shy when she heard the laughter coming from the wind. She covered her face with her hands, and her cheeks were so red that it looked as if they were about to bleed. However, her big sparkling eyes were full of passion and expectation. Li Yundong couldn't understand what they were saying, but he was not stupid. Seeing that these people's eyes were full of admiration and awe, as well as a cunning light, as if they were plotting against him, he muttered in his heart, "What are these guys laughing at?" Changbajila saw that Li Yundong was a little embarrassed under everyone's gaze, so he waved his hand and said, "Well, go back to sleep. We still have to hurry up early tomorrow morning." Only then did the crowd disperse. After pointing at Li Yundong for a while, the two foreigners and the Chinese tour guide also returned to their tents. Li Yundong hadn't expected that his practice in the wilderness would alarm so many people. He secretly made up his mind that before he found a suitable place to start the Zhuji phase, he would never do such a shocking thing again. Li Yundong returned to his tent and slept for the night. At dawn, he heard the sound of chants, the sound of whips lashing the cows and horses, and the loud shouts of people coming from the camp. Among them, the loudest and clearest was the voice of a girl singing loudly. Although she was singing in Tibetan and Li Yundong couldn't understand it, the melody was high and melodious, making Li Yundong feel relaxed and happy. He couldn't help but praise it in his heart. After getting out of the tent, Li Yundong saw that the Tibetans were busy tearing down the tents and packing them up on the oxcarts and carriages. When some of the Tibetans saw Li Yundong, they were no longer as vigilant and cautious as before. They all smiled and greeted Li Yundong warmly. There were also some old Tibetan women who enthusiastically served him hot milk wine and highland barley cakes. Li Yundong was infected by their enthusiasm. He smiled and drank the milk wine in one gulp, then ate a few highland barley cakes. Suddenly, these Tibetans smiled happily and treated Li Yundong even more warmly. Watch net. Meiduo had cried because of the separation between the two of them. She asked with tears in her eyes, "What happened after that?" "After that?" Li Yundong let out a long sigh and said slowly, "After that, I understood a truth." Meiduo wiped away her tears and asked, "What is it?" Li Yundong sighed and said, "A man must be strong. If a man is not strong, he can't even protect himself, let alone the woman he loves." "So, you came here to cultivate?" Meiduo asked. Li Yundong nodded. "Yes, that's right." Meiduo was moved and said, "No wonder you walked all the way here. It turns out that you did it for the girl you love." Li Yundong smiled at Meiduo. "The song you sang before was really good. I asked Buddha, why does it always snow on a night that I don't care about? Buddha said, when people don't pay attention, they always miss a lot of real beauty. What a good song, but some real beauty is destined not to belong to me. If people are too greedy, they may even lose what they already have. Don't you think so? Meiduo's eyes were fixed on Li Yundong. Although she had been rejected by Li Yundong, her love and admiration for this boy in her heart had deepened. She admired Li Yundong's courage and boldness in order to eradicate evil people, regardless of his own safety. She admired Li Yundong's persistence and perseverance in embarking on an extremely difficult cultivation for the girl he loved. Go to the internet. Meiduo's eyes were full of infatuation. She looked at Li Yundong's thick eyebrows and straight nose. She had always thought that this Han brother was not very handsome with a beard, but at this time, he looked mature, steady, and resolute. In the face of Li Yundong's question, Meiduo said in a daze, Han brother, I understand. I won't stop you from cultivating. Can I sing another song for you? Li Yundong smiled and said, okay, your singing is really like the sound of nature. It's so beautiful. Meiduo thought to herself, no matter how beautiful it is, it can't capture your heart. She calmed down, opened her red lips slightly, and sang. You see me, or you don't see me. I'm there, neither sad nor happy. You read me, or you don't miss me. Love is there, neither coming nor going. You love me, or you don't love me. Love is there, neither increasing nor decreasing. You follow me, or you don't want to follow me. My hand is in your hand, and I won't give it up. Come to my arms, or let me live in your heart. Silence, love, silence, joy. Meiduo's singing was sad and touching. For a moment, Li Yundong was stunned. After Meiduo finished singing, she looked at Li Yundong in a daze. She saw that Li Yundong's eyes were fixed on the distance, and his expression was full of memories. Her heart was sour and bitter, and for a moment, she couldn't help but burst into tears. Meiduo wiped her tears, sobbed, turned her head, and ran back to her tent. She didn't even want the clothes on the ground. Li Yundong sat alone by the river in a daze. After a long time, he came to his senses and let out a long sigh. Early the next morning, Li Yundong took all his luggage to Chengbajila and said goodbye to him. What? You're leaving? Chengbajila was shocked and asked loudly. Li Yundong nodded and said with a firm expression, yes, I've disturbed you for several days. I'm a cultivator, and it's better for me to be alone. Chengbajila opened his mouth. He wanted to ask him to stay, but he didn't know what to say. After a long time, he sighed and said, Han boy, you didn't give me a chance. Let me treat you to a feast when I get back and repay you for saving my life. Li Yundong smiled and said, Chengbajila, I'm already very grateful for the Mahamudra Secret Method Sutra you gave me. It's very useful to me. You don't have to be so polite anymore. I have to leave today. Seeing that Li Yundong had made up his mind, Chengbajila didn't force him to stay. He just asked, does Meiduo know? Li Yundong nodded. Chengbajila sighed and said, this child, alas, shall I ask her to see you off? Li Yundong shook his head and said, forget it. As he said this, he carried the fan of 7 treasures and his luggage and left Chengbajila's tent. Chengbajila chased after him and led a horse next to him. He stuffed the reins into Li Yundong's hand and said, take this with you. When you're tired on the way, it can also lighten your burden. Li Yundong smiled and said, Chengbajila, I'm a cultivator. How can I do such a lazy thing? It's like taking a break on a pilgrimage. Would you be willing? Chengbajila was silent. After a while, he said, then you should bring more food and water. That should be fine, right? Li Yundong thought for a moment and accepted Chengbajila's kindness with a smile. He took a bag of Highland barley cakes and a pot full of milk wine and set off again. At this time, the Tibetans in the camp had heard that Li Yundong was leaving, so they came over to say goodbye to him. Li Yundong smiled and said hello to them. He glanced around the crowd but didn't see Meiduo. He sighed in his heart and turned to leave. When Li Yundong had become a small black dot on the horizon, Meiduo ran over, panting. As she ran, she shouted, "Changbajila, Han brother is leaving?" When she ran to Changbajila, she stopped and looked at Li Yundong's back with a sad face. She held a pair of cloth shoes that had just been sewn in her hand and bit her lip tightly. She was silent, tears falling down her cheeks. Changbajila sighed and said, "Hurry up and catch up with him on my horse. It's not too late." Meiduo shook her head and choked with sobs. "If he has me in his heart, he will look back. When he does, I will catch up with him and give him this pair of shoes. He has such a long way to go. How can he go without shoes?" She looked at Li Yundong's back all the way, but he never looked back until his figure finally disappeared into the horizon. Meiduo couldn't help it anymore. She lay on Changbajila's shoulder and cried loudly. As she cried, she said, "Why won't he look back at me? Is there no place for me in his heart at all?" Changbajila stroked Meiduo's hair lovingly. "Silly girl, he's afraid that if he looks back at you, you will really live in his heart." When Meiduo heard this, she felt a little better. She wiped her tears and looked at Changbajila eagerly. "Is what you said true?" Changbajila smiled and sighed slightly. "Well, don't cry. If fate wills it, we will meet again in the future." Meiduo looked in the direction where Li Yundong had gone and couldn't help singing again. "That day, I closed my eyes in the fragrant mist of the scripture hall. Suddenly, I heard the mantra in your chanting. That month, I shook all the scripture buckets, not to release souls, but to touch your fingertips. That year, I kowtowed and crawled on the mountain road, not to see you, but to feel your warmth. That life, I turned the mountains, the rivers, and the pagodas, not to cultivate the next life, but to meet you on the way." Meiduo's singing was pleasant to the ear, and these Tibetan compatriots all knew it. But at this time, Meiduo was singing from the bottom of her heart, and every sentence was from the bottom of her heart. Her true feelings were revealed, and her singing was particularly beautiful and touching. For a moment, everyone was stunned. The world was extremely quiet, and only the Tibetan girl's singing echoed gently, /om/. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.